Doctrine over self. The individual is subordinate to the group, leader, and teachings. When personal desires, goals, and values conflict with group values, they become selfish or immoral, or they're considered selfish or immoral. So basically, if your own internal thoughts, if your own conscience conflict with what you know the right way to think is according to the group and its dogma, there's pressure for you internally, even if not externally, for you to conform your mind to the group's expectations because they are always considered to be right, whereas your own thoughts may be flawed.
Yeah, we've gone through a lot of similar sort of aspects so far, but I mean, it is present for sure.
One of the things you've mentioned in the past where you would have something considered internalized transphobia, if you ever had any thoughts that contradicted what the claims of the movement were, well, then they could just say that you're just hating on yourself because you've internalized some of the messaging that are anti-trans from society around you, and it's just part of your unconscious bias that's showing up. And I think that would be one way to have the group reinforce this notion of doctrine over self, where the doctrine and the ideas of the group are more true even than your own innate sense of yourself in that regard.
Exactly.
It's interesting, though, but because everything is so focused on identity and your own description of your identity, then it almost seems like there's a notion of self that's at the corner of all of this, but it's a notion of self that can only be expressed in the right way, in the way that is prescribed by the group. And I think that makes it harder for people who may feel an impulse towards some more conventional ways of being. But I guess that's hard to do. Even with the past thing about identity, there's this idea of identity foreclosure, where if you're a therapist and you're working with kids and young adults, you're not supposed to really get them to settle on an identity that is so solid and fixed that it prevents them from reinventing themselves if they feel like that's the right thing for them at any particular given time. And because this is so focused on identity and self-described identity, then once young kids get into this way of being, then they start to see themselves as defined by their membership in this community and what that means for them as non-binary or as trans. That's who they are. They now have centered their identity in that aspect of their lives. And it then becomes foreclosed on, where they don't allow themselves the freedom to consider and experiment with different ways of being, which is a normal phenomenon. You know, I grew up in the 80s and people would go through phases of goth or of roper or skater or the band kid or the cheerleader. Like there were different identities that people would have that would just be part of experimenting with who they were. But none of them carried irreversible consequences. It was just something that people went through. Now that we have these irreversible consequences, it's harder to step back and allow the kids to go through that process like we used to be able to, I guess.
And that's really the main problem with affirming identities, is that you're basically, that's what you're doing. You're foreclosing it.
Yeah. All right. So this notion of doctrine over self, where the doctrine guides your decisions more than your own internal voice. What do you think?
Intense.
Okay. Dispensation of existence. The individual's literal or figurative existence is threatened as a consequence for impurity, doubt, or leaving the group. Life, the eternal soul, self-esteem, a sense of being good, and one's identity hang in the balance. Basically, there's no reason for living, or you have no way of feeling whole or complete if you are not in the group and conforming to the teachings.
Yeah. You know what this reminds me of is there has been recently some graffiti or some people using the catchphrase death before detransition, which I think is a play on death before decaf. But they're basically saying, you will pry my gender identity from my cold dead hands sort of thing. But yeah, it has that same sort of feeling of you're nothing without this group sort of thing. And it really does tie into having a dead name where your old identity is dead. So all that there's left is this identity you currently are and what it means to really the community and the ideology.
Oh, that's a really good insight, just in terms of instead of your past being simply an earlier season of your life, it is the source of death. It's something that's dead and cold then it doesn't really feel like anything that could be returned to or revisited that kind of leaves you with only this identity to hang. Really fascinating.
When people say death before detransition, it really ties into when a lot of people will say that if you criticize anything about transition or you criticize the ideology itself, you're claiming that trans people don't exist, or you're challenging their existence. So I think it ties into that also.
What do you think? How big of a footprint does this particular one leave in your life when you're in the middle of it?
I think it's intense.